Hi, sixth graders. It's science time. So I'm going to make today's a little shorter than I did yesterday's. I said it was going to be a mini lesson, and it was the longest one I've done so far. So today I'm going to talk to you about food chains and food webs. And those things are very similar and they are related, but they're also different. So I want to talk to you first about a food chain, and I made a really simple food chain to show you. Basically, a food chain is a diagram that shows how energy or food is transferred from one living thing to another living thing. And I like to start a food chain with the sun, because the sun is that source of energy that is kind of fueling photosynthesis for plants, which allows plants to make their own food. So as you can see there, it starts with the sun. And in a food chain, the arrow always goes to what is receiving the energy, or what is consuming the energy, or getting it. So the sun is providing the source of energy that is an apple tree, that apple tree needs in order to produce its food. So we start with the sun, and it gives energy to the apple tree. And then the next thing I have is a squirrel, and as you can see, the squirrel's eating an apple. So the energy from the apple is now being transferred to the squirrel. The squirrel is eating the apple. And then there are a lot of different possibilities, and that kind of goes along with food webs. But in this particular food chain, there's an animal called a mink. And a mink is actually a predator of a squirrel. So in this particular food chain, the mink is eating the squirrel. And again, the reason the arrow is pointing to the mink is we always point to who's getting the energy. So that squirrel that is getting eaten by the mink is providing that mink with energy. And then after that, we have a coyote. And a coyote is going to eat that mink in this particular food chain. So the mink is giving energy to the coyote. I stopped the food chain there, kind of, because coyotes don't have a lot of natural predators. Of course, it could be killed in a fight, could be killed by a hunter, could die of natural causes or from an injury. But I kind of had him as the top of the food chain. But eventually that coyote will die. And at that point, then, it is the decomposer's job to break down the body of that coyote. And when it does that with usually bacteria, fungus, earthworms can help, those nutrients from that coyote's body will go back into the soil. And that's kind of why I started it over again with the apple tree, because once those nutrients can return to the soil, that soil can help grow plants again. So this is one example of a food chain. Each of those consumers, so if you can count, we have a producer with the apple tree. There are 3 consumers. And they have special names based on where they are on the food chain. So that squirrel that is eating the plant, it is called a primary consumer. So primary is kind of a word that means first. So those animals at the bottom of the food chain that are eating plants, they are called primary consumers. The next one, in this case, the mink. So those animals that eat meat, but they're not the top of the food chain, we call them secondary consumers. So the mink in this case is the secondary consumer. And the top of the food chain, in this case the coyote, he is the 3rd consumer in this food chain, and it is a really cool word. It's called tertiary, and that is kind of a fancy word for 3rd. So in this case, we have the primary consumer is a squirrel, secondary consumer is the mink, and the tertiary consumer is the coyote. So this is one example of a food chain. Now, the reason food chains are not completely accurate is we know that in nature, these animals don't strictly eat just one thing. Squirrels do not just eat green apples, right? They eat a lot of different foods. And minks are going to eat a lot of different foods. They're going to eat whatever is available to them. And same way with coyotes. And that's when we need a food web. So this confusing looking diagram is known as a food web. So it's a little bit more accurate because it shows all the different things, living things in a habitat that could be eaten or eat other things. So just like the food chain, and it's kind of cut off a little bit, but you can see at the bottom it does start with producers. It starts with those plants. And then the things that eat the plants are that first row, and you can see right there, primary consumers. All of those things are those herbivores. So those are those consumers that are going to eat plants, and you can see lots of different examples from birds to insects to deer. Above those, we have those secondary consumers, so those meat eaters, but yet they're not at the top of the food chain, so they also could be eaten by another animal. And then lastly, at the top of this food web, we have again those tertiary consumers. So those are those meat eaters that are pretty much at the top of the food chain, meaning they don't have a lot of natural predators. But you can see all these different arrows because that's a little more realistic. So all those arrows are pointing to the different things that eat other things. So if you look at that bobcat, for example, look at all those arrows. It has, what, 4 different arrows pointing to it? So that's a little more realistic because it shows in this particular web 4 different kinds of food that bobcat could eat. So that marten, that pine marten, that little animal there, could give energy to the bobcat. The bobcat could eat it. Just like that jackrabbit there, the bobcat could eat that too. So that's just an example of what one particular food web could look like versus a food chain, which is just one piece of that bigger food web. So I hope that makes sense to you, and I kept it pretty short today. I'm going to have you practice some activities with reading those food chains and those food webs and getting used to those words, primary, secondary, and tertiary consumers. So that's it for science today. I hope you have a fantastic day, and if you have any questions about science, feel free to message me on It's Learning. See you for tomorrow's video. Bye.